Mommy. My eyes hurt, for words that immediately sent a jolt of unease through me. My 5-year-old son looked unusually troubled, his small frame weighed down by something unseen. What do you mean, sweetheart? I asked, crouching to his level. His big brown eyes, usually brimming with curiosity, were now red and watery, as if he'd spent the whole night crying. They itch and they hurt, he whispered, rubbing his eyes with tiny fists. I gently pulled his hands away and leaned in for a closer look. What I saw froze me in place. Tiny red veins, spider-like and unnaturally intricate, crawled across the whites of his eyes, and his pupils seemed disturbingly dilated. Let's get you to a doctor, I said softly, trying to keep the fear out of my voice. The drive to the clinic felt endless. My son sat in his booster seat, quietly staring out the window, his usual chatter replaced by a heavy silence. Every few minutes, I glanced in the rearview mirror, hoping to catch a glimpse of his familiar curiosity. But his little hands fidgeted restlessly, and his head tilted to one side as though the weight of his thoughts was too much to bear. The pediatrician's office was busier than usual, and we had to wait nearly an hour before being called in. By then, I'd chewed my nails down to nothing. Dr. Reynolds, a calm, middle-aged woman with kind eyes, greeted us. What seems to be the problem? My son says his eyes hurt, and they look wrong. I stammered, unsure how to even describe what I'd seen. Dr. Reynolds motioned for my son to sit on the examination table. He obeyed without a word, which was unlike him. Usually, he'd be asking a million questions about the instruments in the room. She examined him carefully, shining a light into his eyes and asking him to follow her finger. The longer she looked, the more her professional demeanor faltered. Mrs. Carter, she said finally, stepping back. I'm not entirely sure what's causing this. Is it an infection? I asked, clutching the strap of my bag. Possibly, but she hesitated, her brow furrowing. The dilation of his pupils and the redness, it's highly unusual. I'd like to refer you to an ophthalmologist for further testing. My stomach churned. How soon can we see one? I'll make the call myself, she said. This might take priority. Her reassurance felt hollow. As we left the clinic, my son tugged on my sleeve. Mommy, he said quietly, his voice carrying an edge of fear. It feels like something is moving. Moving where, baby? In my eyes, he whispered. We managed to get an appointment with the ophthalmologist the next morning. The night before was restless. My son woke up crying twice, clutching at his face. It's worse, he whimpered. It feels like they're crawling. I held him until he fell asleep, my heart pounding with a terror I couldn't fully understand. The ophthalmologist, Dr. Novak, was a stern, no-nonsense man in his late 50s. His office was lined with charts of human anatomy and rows of polished, intimidating equipment. Let's take a look, he said, motioning my son toward the examination chair. The lights dimmed, and Dr. Novak adjusted a machine over my son's face. I sat tensely, watching as the doctor's calm expression gradually shifted into something more unsettled. He muttered, leaning closer to the screen. What is it? I asked, my voice cracking. Dr. Novak didn't answer immediately. Instead, he pulled back and turned to me. Mrs. Carter, have you noticed anything unusual with your son recently? Any strange behavior, injuries, or new environments? No, nothing out of the ordinary, I replied quickly. Just this, his eyes started hurting out of nowhere. Dr. Novak frowned, turning the monitor toward me. The image was a magnified view of my son's eye, only it wasn't normal. Beneath the cornea, something was moving. Tiny, thread-like shapes wriggled and twisted, their movements deliberate and alive. I gasped, clapping a hand over my mouth. What is that? It appears to be some kind of parasite, he said gravely. I've never seen anything quite like this before. My son shifted uncomfortably in the chair, his small hands gripping the armrests. Mommy, it hurts, he said, his voice trembling. Dr. Novak stood abruptly. We need to act fast. I'm calling a specialist. This might require immediate intervention. The word intervention hit me like a hammer. You mean surgery? He nodded. It's likely the only way to remove them safely. If we don't, the parasites could spread deeper, potentially reaching his brain. My knees buckled, and I had to grip the edge of the table to stay upright. How did this happen? How does something like this even get in his eyes? That's what I intend to find out, he said, already picking up the phone. I sat down beside my son, brushing his hair away from his damp forehead. He looked up at me, his eyes glassy and filled with trust. Mommy, are they going to take them out? Yes, sweetheart, I whispered, my voice breaking. They're going to make you all better. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. The surgery was scheduled for the next day. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the monitor, the writhing parasites squirming beneath the delicate surface of my son's cornea. I stayed by his bed, watching him as he tossed and turned, occasionally muttering in his sleep. Around 2 a.m., he woke up crying, clutching his face again. They're moving more, Mommy, he sobbed. I cradled him in my arms, trying to soothe him, but a gnawing dread settled deep in my chest. Whatever was inside him, it wasn't natural. The hospital the next morning was sterile and cold, the kind of place where time seemed to crawl. Dr. Novak greeted us alongside a younger surgeon, Dr. Elizabeth Reiner, who would be performing the operation. We're going to take good care of him, Dr. Reiner assured me, though her tone betrayed a flicker of uncertainty. My son clung to me as they prepped him, his small hands gripping my sweater like a lifeline. Mommy, will it hurt? No, baby, I said, choking back tears. You won't feel a thing. I promise. He gave me a hesitant nod before letting the nurse guide him into the operating room. I was allowed to stay in the observation area, separated by a glass wall. The surgical team moved with precision as they set up the equipment. My son lay unconscious on the table, his tiny frame dwarfed by the machinery around him. The procedure began with a small incision in his sclera. Everything seemed routine at first, the surgeons working with quiet focus. Then came the moment they reached the parasites. Oh my God, Dr. Reiner muttered, her voice barely audible through the intercom. One of the nurses gasped, dropping a tray of instruments with a clatter. What's happening? I yelled, pressing my palms against the glass. Inside the operating room, the team stepped back, their faces pale. Dr. Novak peered into the microscope, his hand trembling as he adjusted the focus. They're burrowing deeper, he said, almost like they sense what we're doing. Dr. Reiner took over, her movements sharp and deliberate as she attempted to extract one of the wriggling intruders. The moment her forceps touched the parasite, it recoiled violently, emitting a faint but high-pitched sound that seemed to reverberate through the room. What the hell? One of the nurses whispered. They're reacting to sound or vibration, Dr. Novak said, his voice strained. Keep steady. Don't let them reach the optic nerve. I stood frozen, watching as the surgeons fought against the alien-like creatures embedded in my son's eyes. The parasites writhed more aggressively now, their movements erratic. One of them slithered out from the incision, dropping onto the operating table. Contain it, Dr. Reiner shouted. A nurse quickly trapped it under a glass container, but my stomach churned at the sight. The parasite was translucent, about an inch long, with tiny, pulsating appendages along its length. It thrashed wildly, as if seeking something. Get it to the lab immediately, Dr. Novak ordered, his voice firm despite the chaos. The team resumed their work, extracting the remaining parasites with painstaking care. Each one reacted violently, making the procedure agonizingly slow. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Dr. Reiner stepped back, her hands covered in blood and sweat. We got them all, she said, exhaling shakily. I collapsed into a chair, tears streaming down my face. Relief washed over me, but it was tinged with lingering dread. Dr. Novak and Dr. Reiner met me in the waiting room after the surgery. Your son is stable, Dr. Novak said. He'll need time to recover, but he should be able to regain full vision. Thank you, I said, gripping his hand tightly. Dr. Reiner hesitated before speaking. We're running tests on the parasites now, but whatever they are, they're unlike anything we've ever seen. What do you mean? They're not a known species, she said, her brow furrowed. And they don't behave like typical parasites. It's almost as if they're intelligent. Her words sent a chill down my spine. What does that mean for my son? We'll monitor him closely, Dr. Novak said. For now, he's safe. But if you notice anything unusual, anything at all, call us immediately. I nodded, but deep down, I knew this wasn't over. The days following the surgery were a blur of relief and anxiety. My son seemed to recover quickly, though he remained quieter than usual. The redness in his eyes faded, and he even smiled again, a small ray of normalcy piercing through the storm. But deep inside, I couldn't shake the unease. A week later, Dr. Novak called. We've completed the preliminary tests on the parasites, he said. His voice was calm, but there was an edge of something unspoken. What did you find? There was a pause. We still don't know exactly what they are, but their cellular structure is foreign. Not just to humans, but to Earth entirely. I gripped the phone tighter. What are you saying? We're saying they might not be terrestrial, he replied gravely. My world tilted. What does that mean for my son? Is he safe? As far as we can tell, yes, Novak said. The surgery was successful, and we've found no remaining traces in his system. But you'll need to watch for any unusual symptoms. His words replayed in my mind that night as I tucked my son into bed. He looked so peaceful, his soft breathing the only sound in the room. I leaned down and kissed his forehead. Mommy, he murmured, half asleep. Yes, sweetheart. They weren't bad, he whispered. My heart stopped. What do you mean, baby? The little things in my eyes, he said. They were trying to talk to me. They said they wanted to go home. I stared at him, my blood turning to ice. When did they say that? Before the doctors took them out, he mumbled, his voice fading as he drifted off. I sat there in the dark, my mind racing. What had those creatures been? What did they want? And why had they chosen my son? It's been 2 months since the surgery. My son is healthy and happy, but I can't escape the nagging feeling that this isn't the end. Some nights, when the house is quiet, I hear him talking in his sleep. The words are soft and garbled, but they don't sound like English or any language I've ever heard. Last night, as I passed his room, I thought I saw a faint, flickering light under his closed door. When I opened it, the light was gone, and he was fast asleep. I don't know what's happening, but I'm afraid. Afraid that whatever was inside him isn't entirely gone. The email came late at night, the subject line reading, Urgent, tenant complaint. I had taken over managing the old apartment building on Chestnut Street just a few months prior. It was a crumbling relic, with flickering hallway lights, creaking floors, and tenants who mostly kept to themselves. The pay wasn't great, but it covered the bills, and the work was manageable until now. The message was from one of the third-floor tenants, Mrs. Delgado, a quiet woman in her 60s. Her email was short and to the point. Something's wrong with the new guy in 3B. Please check it out. I sighed, leaning back in my chair. The new guy had moved in just 2 weeks ago. His application was spotless. Good credit, steady job, no criminal record. But I'd only seen him once during the move-in, and even then, he'd barely said a word, keeping his face hidden under a hood. Guess I'll check it out tomorrow, I muttered, closing the laptop. The next morning, I knocked on the door to 3B. No response. I knocked again, louder this time. Mr. Carter? I called. Still nothing. I leaned closer, trying to hear any movement inside. What I heard instead was a faint sound, like whispering. It wasn't a TV or a radio. It was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Mr. Carter? I tried again, my voice louder, more insistent. The whispering stopped. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, but before I could decide what to do, the door creaked open just a crack. A single eye peered out, bloodshot and sunken. Yes, his voice was a hoarse rasp. Hi, I'm the building manager, I said, forcing a smile. One of your neighbors mentioned some noise last night. Just wanted to check if everything's all right. He stared at me for a long moment, his eye unblinking. Everything's fine. Before I could say another word, The door slammed shut. Later that evening, Mrs. Delgado stopped me as I was locking up the office. "Did you talk to him?" she asked, her eyes darting nervously toward the third floor. "I did," I said. "He said everything's fine." She shook her head, her expression tightening. "It's not fine. Last night, I heard something." "What kind of something?" Her voice dropped to a whisper. It sounded like crying, but not just him. It was like there were others in there. "I swear I heard a woman. Maybe a child." I frowned. "Are you sure?" "I know what I heard," she insisted, clutching her cardigan tightly around her. "You need to check his apartment. Something's not right." Mrs. Delgado's words stuck with me long after she retreated to her apartment. Crying? A woman? A child? I couldn't shake the unease that settled in my chest. The next day, I knocked on Mr. Carter's door again. This time, there was no answer at all. No whispers, no creaking floorboards, nothing. The silence felt oppressive, like the air was thicker outside his apartment. I decided to use the spare key. Technically, I was only supposed to enter for emergencies or maintenance requests, but something about this situation felt like it qualified. Sliding the key into the lock, I hesitated. A faint, metallic smell wafted through the crack around the door. Blood? No, not quite. It was sharper, more chemical. "Mr. Carter?" I called one last time. When there was no response, I turned the key and pushed the door open. The apartment was dark, the blinds drawn tightly over the windows. The faint glow of the hallway light spilled in, casting long shadows across the room. It was sparse, almost unnaturally so. No furniture except for a folding chair and a small table, both positioned awkwardly in the center of the room. The table held a single object, a tape recorder. I took a cautious step inside, the floor creaking beneath me. The chemical smell was stronger now, almost making my eyes water. I glanced around but saw no signs of anyone, no signs of life at all, really. My gaze landed back on the tape recorder. Curiosity clawed at me. Slowly, I pressed the play button. The tape clicked, then hissed with static. For a moment, there was nothing, and then a voice crackled through. It wasn't Mr. Carter's voice. It was a woman's. "Please," she whispered, her words trembling. "Please help me. He's not what he says he is. He's not." The tape cut off abruptly. My breath caught in my throat. My fingers hovered over the stop button, but before I could press it, the tape clicked again, continuing on its own. This time, it was a child's voice. "Don't let him see you listening. He doesn't like it when people know." A chill ran down my spine. My hand shook as I pressed stop, the recorder falling silent. I spun around, heart pounding, suddenly feeling exposed in the empty apartment. The shadows in the room seemed darker now, almost alive. That's when I noticed the closet door. It was slightly ajar, just enough for me to see the faint outline of something inside. "Mr. Carter?" I called again, my voice trembling. The closet door creaked open. The closet door creaked open slowly, revealing a sliver of shadowed interior. My breath hitched, and I stepped back instinctively, the tape recorder still clutched in my trembling hands. "Mr. Carter?" I called out again, though I was certain I didn't want an answer. The door stopped moving, hanging open just wide enough to reveal nothing. At least, nothing obvious. The space inside was dark and empty, save for a faint, glimmering smear on the wooden floor. I squinted, leaning slightly closer. It was a trail of something wet and sticky, leading deeper into the closet and disappearing into the darkness. The chemical smell was stronger here, sharp enough to sting my nostrils. Gathering what little courage I had left, I fumbled for my phone and turned on its flashlight. The beam cut through the shadows, illuminating the cramped interior. At first, I saw only dust and peeling paint on the closet walls. Then my light hit something metallic. A set of chains. They were bolted to the floor, thick and rusted, with jagged edges that looked as though they'd been clawed or bitten. The chains led to a small, tattered piece of fabric, a child's blanket, smeared with dark stains. I stumbled back, nearly dropping my phone. My foot caught on something, and I glanced down. A boot. It wasn't mine, and it didn't belong to a child. It was heavy, mud-caked, and far too large for Mr. Carter's wiry frame. Before I could process what I was seeing, a noise broke the silence, a faint rustling, like the sound of dry leaves being crumpled. It came from deeper in the apartment. I spun around, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. "Who's there?" The beam landed on the far corner of the room. At first I saw nothing but then movement. A figure stepped out of the shadows, slow and deliberate. It was Mr. Carter. Only it wasn't. His face was wrong. The skin seemed stretched too tightly over his skull, his eyes sunken and ringed with deep shadows. His mouth twitched, curving into a jagged approximation of a smile. "You shouldn't have come in," he said, his voice low and distorted, like two voices speaking in unison. I just wanted to check," I stammered, backing toward the door. "You heard it, didn't you?" he interrupted, his head tilting unnaturally to one side. "The tape. They like to talk when I'm not around." My heart pounded as I glanced toward the open door. It felt impossibly far away. "They're mine now," he continued, taking a slow step closer. His bare feet left faint, damp prints on the floor. "But they always try to leave. Always whispering. Always calling for help." What did you do?" I choked out. His smile widened, splitting his face in a way that didn't look human. "I show them the truth. And soon, I'll show you." I bolted for the door. As I reached the hallway, I heard the sound of heavy footsteps behind me, faster than they should have been. My hands fumbled with the lock, adrenaline making me clumsy, but I managed to slam the door shut just as a shadow loomed behind it. The doorknob rattled violently, and then there was silence. For a long moment, I stood there, my chest heaving as I tried to catch my breath. But the silence was short-lived. From behind the door, I heard it again, the whispering. Only now it wasn't faint. It was loud, urgent, and filled with a chorus of voices, men, women, and children, all speaking at once. "Don't let him out," they said. "Don't let him find you." The whispers continued, their voices rising in urgency. I backed away from the door, my legs trembling as fear coursed through me. The hallway lights flickered overhead, casting erratic shadows that danced like living things. I clutched the tape recorder tightly, unsure why I hadn't dropped it in my panic. Somehow, it felt like the only proof I had that any of this was real. I turned and sprinted down the hall, past Mrs. Delgado's door. She opened it just a crack as I passed, her face pale and fearful. "What's going on?" she hissed. "Stay inside," I shouted without stopping. By the time I reached the lobby, my chest burned from exertion. The building's heavy front door groaned as I shoved it open, and the cold night air hit me like a slap. I didn't stop running until I reached my car. At home, I locked every door and window, drawing the curtains tight. My hands still shook as I replayed the events in my head, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I stared at the tape recorder on the table, its presence unsettling. Finally, I picked it up and pressed play again. The same whispers from before filled the room, but now they were clearer, more distinct. "He's not human," the woman's voice said. "Run while you can," the child added. Then, a new voice, deep and guttural, crackled through the speakers. "You can't escape. They couldn't, and neither will you." The recorder let out a sharp, high-pitched screech, and I dropped it, my heart hammering. The device landed on the floor, its casing cracking open. The next morning, I called the police. They sounded skeptical, but agreed to send someone to check the apartment. I waited anxiously, pacing the floor as the hours crawled by. Finally, an officer called me back. "There's no one in 3B, he said. "What do you mean?" I demanded. "He was there yesterday." "The apartment's empty," the officer replied. "No furniture, no belongings." "Nothing." "Are you sure you've got the right unit?" I hung up, my mind racing. "Empty? How could that be?" That night, I lay awake, unable to shake the feeling that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to shift in the corners of my room, and every creak of the house made my skin crawl. Around 3 a.m., I heard it, a faint whisper. "Don't look outside." My breath caught. Slowly, against every instinct, I turned my head toward the window. The curtains fluttered slightly, though there was no breeze. And there, pressed against the glass, was a face. It was Mr. Carter. His bloodshot eyes stared into mine, and his jagged smile widened, impossibly large. The whispers surrounded me, deafening now, as the glass cracked under the pressure of his presence. I screamed. The next thing I remember is waking up in the hospital. A neighbor had heard my screams and found me unconscious on the floor. The police dismissed my story as the result of a break-in gone wrong. But the whispers haven't stopped. Even now, as I write this, I hear them faintly in the background. They're warning me, urging me to stay vigilant. Because Mr. Carter isn't gone. He never leaves. The old farmhouse had been in my family for generations, a crumbling relic of better days. When my grandmother passed away, it became mine, a blessing and a curse wrapped in the peeling paint and creaking floorboards. I didn't want to move back to the rural nothingness I'd worked so hard to escape, but the city had become unbearable. After the divorce, I needed somewhere quiet to put my life back together. The first few weeks were uneventful. I spent my days cleaning and unpacking, trying to bring some semblance of life back to the empty house. But then the mirrors started changing. It began subtly. One night, as I was brushing my teeth, I thought I saw something move in the bathroom mirror. Not my reflection. I was standing still, but something behind me. When I turned around, there was nothing there. Just tired, I told myself, shaking it off. But it happened again the next night. This time, the movement was more distinct, like a shadow flickering just out of sight. A few days later, I was cleaning out the attic when I found it, a large, ornate mirror wrapped in dusty sheets. Its frame was intricately carved with twisting vines and strange symbols that I didn't recognize. It was beautiful, but there was something unsettling about it. I almost left it where it was, but the living room had a bare wall that was crying out for something. I lugged the mirror downstairs and hung it, stepping back to admire how it transformed the space. That night, I woke to the sound of faint tapping. At first, I thought it was coming from the window, but when I sat up, my eyes were drawn to the living room. The mirror was directly in view from my bedroom doorway, and in the faint glow of the moonlight, I thought I saw movement. A chill crept down my spine. I got up slowly, padding toward the mirror. The tapping continued, louder now. When I stood in front of the mirror, I froze. My reflection was there, but behind me stood a figure. It was a woman, her face pale and gaunt, her eyes sunken and lifeless. She didn't move. She didn't blink. She just stood there, staring at me through the glass. I spun around, my heart pounding. The room was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the woman was gone. For days, I avoided the mirror. It felt silly, childish even, but every time I walked past it, I felt that same cold dread crawl up my spine. The house was silent, but the mirror had its own kind of presence, a weight in the room I couldn't explain. I tried to distract myself. Cleaning, cooking, anything to keep my mind busy. But it didn't help. The reflection haunted me. And then it happened again. One night, as I was passing the living room, I caught movement out of the corner of my eye. My stomach dropped, and I turned reluctantly toward the mirror. The woman was back. This time, she wasn't alone. There were others, 2, maybe 3, standing just behind her, their faces shadowed but unmistakably human. They didn't move, didn't acknowledge me. They simply stood, watching. I turned away, forcing myself to breathe. "It's not real," I whispered. "You're just imagining things." But when I looked back, the figures were still there. The next day, I called an antique appraiser to take a look at the mirror. Maybe there was something about it, something logical, that could explain everything. The appraiser, an older man with sharp eyes and a soft voice, arrived that afternoon. I led him into the living room, feeling a strange sense of relief as I showed him the mirror. "Interesting piece," he murmured, running his fingers along the carved frame. "Very old, possibly late 18th century. These symbols, they're unusual. I'd have to do some research, but they might be connected to folklore." "Folklore?" I asked, my voice trembling. He nodded. Some cultures believed mirrors could act as portals, not just to other places but other things. Spirits, entities. A chill ran through me. You don't think? He gave me a small smile, clearly trying to put me at ease. It's just superstition, of course. A story to go along with the craftsmanship. But mirrors like these were often used in rituals. Scrying, summoning, things like that. I didn't know what to say. The words hung heavy in the air. As the appraiser packed up to leave, he paused in the doorway. You know, he said thoughtfully, if you're not comfortable with it, you could always sell it. Pieces like this fetch a good price, especially with the right story attached. I'll think about it, I lied. That night, I had the first dream. I was standing in front of the mirror, but it wasn't in my house. The room around me was cold and empty, with cracked walls and a faint smell of damp earth. In the mirror, the woman was closer than ever, her face inches from mine. Her lips moved, but no sound came out. Behind her, the other figures grew clearer. They were men, women, and children, their faces twisted with fear and despair. I tried to step back, but my feet wouldn't move. The woman raised a hand, pressing it against the glass. And then somehow I felt it. Her hand wasn't on the glass, it was on me. I woke up gasping, drenched in sweat. The room was dark, the house silent. But the air felt heavy, charged with something unseen. My phone buzzed on the nightstand, startling me. It was a message from a block number. Help us. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. Before I could react, another message appeared. The mirror is a door. I spent the next day in a haze, trying to convince myself that the text messages were some kind of prank. But deep down, I knew better. Something was wrong with the mirror, and whatever was inside it wasn't going to leave me alone. That evening, I decided to get rid of it. I grabbed an old blanket, intending to wrap the mirror and shove it back into the attic where it belonged. But as I approached, the air around it grew cold. My breath fogged in the room, and the edges of the mirror began to shimmer faintly like a heat wave in reverse. The woman appeared again. But this time, she wasn't alone, and she wasn't still. Her hand pressed against the glass, and the figures behind her began to move, their mouths opening and closing in silent cries. She locked eyes with me, her expression desperate. Help us, her voice rasped, audible for the first time. I froze. What are you? I whispered. They took us, she said, her words broken and hoarse. He trapped us here. We can't leave. Who trapped you? Her gaze shifted, and the shadows in the mirror began to twist. Behind her, something darker moved, a massive, shifting shape that radiated malice. Him, she whispered. The mirror rattled violently, and the room seemed to darken. I stumbled back, my heart racing. The shape in the mirror pressed closer, its edges writhing like smoke. Break it, the woman screamed. Break the mirror. I grabbed the nearest heavy object, a cast-iron candle holder, and swung it with all my strength. The mirror cracked, a jagged fissure spreading across its surface. A deep, guttural roar filled the room, shaking the walls. The figures in the mirror began to dissolve, their faces twisting into nothingness as the glass shattered further. With one final swing, the mirror exploded, sending shards flying in all directions. The roar cut off abruptly, leaving an oppressive silence in its wake. I stood there, panting, surrounded by shards of broken glass. The air felt lighter, as if whatever had been in the mirror was finally gone. But as I looked closer, my relief turned to dread. The largest piece of the shattered mirror still reflected the room, but it wasn't my living room. It was the cold, cracked space from my dream. And in the reflection, the woman was gone. The dark shape remained. I threw the shards into a box, wrapped it in tape, and drove to the nearest river. Without hesitation, I hurled the box into the water, watching as it sank beneath the surface. For the first time in weeks, I felt free. But that night, as I lay in bed, the dream returned. I stood in the same cold, empty room. The woman was nowhere to be seen. The dark shape moved closer, its form twisting and shifting. You broke the door, it growled, its voice low and menacing. Now I'm free. I woke up screaming, and this time, I wasn't sure if I had truly escaped, or if something far worse had followed me into my world.